Hello, my name is Osha. I like talking about American presidents. Today, I'm going to be discussing the education of two of our founding fathers, James Madison, who was our fourth president, and Thomas Jefferson, who was our third president. I'll touch on John Adams' education as well. He was our second president. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on these two people, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, is because of their role in the authorship of our, founding documents. I'm talking about the Declaration of Independence. Of course, Thomas Jefferson was the main author of the Declaration of Independence. Uh, Although John Adams was a member of the Committee of Five, the five people who drafted the uh, Declaration of Independence. They included John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Uh, John Adams uh, insisted on Thomas Jefferson being the main author because of what he called his felicity of expression. So today, a reason why I'm focusing on their education is to be able to go into how it is that they acquired their writing skills, right? Their literary skills. Because even after 250 years, the documents they authored remain significant today. They remain our North Star. I'm talking about the Declaration of Independence and, of course, the U.S. Constitution. Now, James Madison is often called the father of our Constitution. He didn't write the whole thing, but he was the main drafter. And of course, he did author the Bill of Rights. Those are the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. I've done a video discussing the Bill of Rights. So, a reason I also decided to discuss the education was because education has become a hot topic in the United States with the young people saying they don't want to go to college because of the astronomical costs, and even the government, it's seems to be pivoting on policies that uh, you know that don't favor free public education, and so I'm going to go into the educational background of our founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson supported free public education. He was responsible. He was the founder and pioneer of University of Virginia, which was a public university. It still exists today. But the younger people have a valid point. The cost of college education is astronomical today, and many of our founding fathers, apart from George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, they had college degrees, but Benjamin Franklin was an autodidact. So I'm going to go into, the importance of the college education that our founding fathers had, and how it affected and impacted, the founding documents that remain our North Star today. Right? I'm talking about the Declaration of Independence and, of course, the U.S. Constitution. So let me quickly read. It's very important. I want to just quickly read the directly just portions, the preamble, and you see the style. They had an introduction. I'll start with the Declaration of Independence, which was authored by Thomas Jefferson. Remember, John Adams chose Thomas Jefferson because of what he called his felicity of expression, and I will get into while they demonstrated the style that they had as I get into discussing, their education and their curriculum. So I'm going to do that. So I think that's very important. So the Declaration of Independence, it has a beginning and introduction, and it's part of what they were, their style, what they were learning. They all took rhetoric, right? Rhetoric was, it's like the study and art of, writing effectively and persuasively, right? So there was so they did rhetoric. Thomas Jefferson studied rhetoric. Um, So did John Adams, so did James Madison. And so you see the mechanics of their writing, their style, the objective. And so let me just quickly look at the text, read from the text, and so I can, dive into it. So the Declaration of Independence, it starts with they start with the introduction, right? Why they're doing what they're doing, right? So it goes, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So you can see he's basically starting off by saying, "This is the purpose why I'm writing this document." Right? He's giving the reason. That's the introduction. He's giving the reason why he's writing this document. Right? The Declaration of Independence, and you see they're following the style of rhetoric. They're following the style of the manner of logic. These were things that were part of their curriculum. And then he goes on to the part we always quote, everybody knows, right? We hold these truths to be self evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, uh, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, right? So it goes on and on. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute uh, new government, laying the foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. So you can see the style. So jo- Thomas Jefferson was also a lawyer. So he's writing in a lawyerly, legally, logical manner. But importantly, notice that even though he's a very educated man, he's a lawyer, his writing is accessible. It remains accessible today, right? It's simple, right? There's this clarity of purpose. There's the simplicity, and there's something concise about it. And that was the manner of the Enlightenment uh, scholars, which they were familiar with at the time, right? Uh, Thomas Jefferson himself was an acolyte. He was a fan of the French Enlightenment scholars that included Voltaire, right, Diderot, and also, they all were familiar with the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, particularly James Madison. The Scottish Enlightenment writers and philosophers were David Hume and Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith is known as the father of economics, and while David Hume is known for his empirical studies and history and philosophy, David Hume. So they were Scottish Enlightenment philosophers. So these were texts that they studied back then. Now, let me read from the U.S. Constitution. Now, this is the preamble, this is the introduction of the U.S. Constitution. We all know these famous words. We, the people, uh, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So you can see how clear, uh, simple, and concise the language is, right? So it's accessible, even though that our founding fathers were called geniuses, right? Anybody can apparently understand what they're writing, right? Anybody can understand them. So it took a lot of training, right? They went to school and trained, to learn like that. So let me start off with uh, Thomas Jefferson, right? Thomas Jefferson, of course, he came from a wealthy background. We also have to mention this, right? Because a reason why I'm doing this video today is to try and encourage young people and the parents of young people. You don't have to be rich to be able to invest in their children's education. Um, to invest in their children's education. And you can see our founding fathers, many of them were very wealthy, but some of them were not, just like John Adams. John Adams' father, John Adams, our second president, his father was a shoemaker and a farmer. And he didn't have a college education himself. He didn't have formal education. He was a deacon as well, but he wanted his son to have the best education. And so he had him study Latin and Greek, rhetoric, logic, before had him enroll in Harvard University. We all know Harvard is the school of elite people today. In fact, John Adams in his youth did not want to go to school, to college. He wanted to be a farmer like his dad. And in his early days, he actually played the truant, right? He was very, he didn't really want to go to school, but later on he took his studies very seriously. He ended up going to Harvard. He did well, and he became a teacher for a while, and then he studied law. So back then, you read law, right? You read law. You didn't go to law school. We didn't have law schools then. Law was a practical profession, and the way you became a lawyer was to go and study under a lawyer in his office, because books were very expensive back then. All right. It was normally wealthy people or professionals who had access to books. And so uh, John Adams went to study law under a lawyer, and that was the manner. You'd go to a lawyer, you'd be apprenticed to them, and you'd be reading law under them, because they're the ones who had the expensive books. Legal books were very expensive back then. Legal books remain expensive today in law school, right? So you would read these legal books, and you would read law under them, and you'd qualify. It typically took maybe 3 to 5 years. I think Thomas Jefferson, he read law under a guy, and a a leading lawyer, and it took him 5 years, right? His legal training took 5 years. That's Thomas Jefferson. So I expect um, John Adams would have spent about the same time as well. So you're an apprentice and you're reading law under them, under a lawyer, and after you study under the attorney, you take the exams for the bar, and then you become, you're licensed to now practice, to strike out on your own. So um, John Adams, as I said, he went to Harvard. He studied, part of what they would study. He studied philosophy. He studied Latin. He studied Greek. He studied rhetoric, right? How to write. Now, I'm not a fan of John Adams' writing. He wrote in a very ponderous manner, and what is so funny is he also studied French. He studied French before he went to Harvard. I think in an earlier video, I mentioned how I read his biography, John Adams, written by David McCullough. And John Adams kept a diary throughout his life. And he notes in his diary, right, when he goes to France to join Benjamin Franklin, who was, the first diplomat, the first minister to France during the war, the Revolutionary War, to try and get the support of France and raise money. He noted that in his diary that Benjamin Franklin was not really conversant in French, that his French was not good. He noted it. And he was writing about how he made a lot of grammatical errors. So you could see that John Adams was sort of a snob. I talked about how John Adams seemed to always be studying Benjamin Franklin. Because Benjamin Franklin, by the way, there's a reason why his French was bad. He didn't go to college. He didn't have formal training. His formal schooling ended by the age of 10 when he ran away from home, right? He was actually from Massachusetts, originally like John Adams, but he ran away from home. Of course, Benjamin Franklin was much older than John Adams. But he ran away from home early. He didn't come from a wealthy home, came from a large home. He was apprenticed to his older brother, who was a printer at the time. But him and his older brother didn't get along. So, he ran away from home at a young age, maybe around, when he was a teen, and he moved to Philadelphia. And he struck off on his own. He established himself as a printer, but he had a lifelong uh, desire for self study. So Benjamin Franklin was an autodidact. Of course, he received several honorary doctorates. He was known as Dr. Franklin. He did receive an honorary doctorate from Oxford University, which was the most prestigious university at that time. It's in the English speaking world. It's still prestigious today. Because he became an inventor. His experiments on electricity. He became America's printer. He printed our currency. Over to about 2.5 million money notes that he printed because he had a printing press. He developed almanacs. He became a writer. He did many different things. But he was self learned. Now his French obviously wasn't good, even though he was diplomat to France. And John Adams notes it in his diary that it looks like um, uh, Benjamin Franklin only acquired his ability to speak French when he got to France, when he assumed his position. And it sort of irritated um, John Adams, who had learned French since he was young. Because so back then in the 18th century, France was the lingua franca of Europe, and it was also the language of scholars. It was the way English is very common today. French was what was common. It was the lingua franca of Europe. It was also the language of the courts, right? So the European courts. So even in Russia, they spoke French. The Russian courts, right? They spoke French. Even in England, right? You remember, till the beginning, the Middle Ages, the early aristocrats of England were actually were the French. They were from France, right? Yeah, they were Germanic tribes. Well, yeah. So, but the early aristocrats, the early aristocracy, the kings were from France and England. So France, because of the court of Versailles as well, the French were seen as the most advanced culturally in Europe at the time. And so France was the language of sophistication, it was the language of international relations, diplomacy, the language of court, the language of, so the language of science, education. Scholars wrote in French. So you see uh, even the early Enlightenment scholars we knew, um, we're writing at least in the Middle Ages, right? After the Middle Ages, the age of the Enlightenment, they were Voltaire, right? I liked Voltaire's Candide, there were Diderot. These people were French people. Yes, way back in classical times, it was Latin, right? And right prior to that, it was Greek. It was Latin, so it evolved. But by the time of our Revolutionary War, French was the lingua franca of Europe, and it was the language of high society. And so you see, Thomas Jefferson was very eloquent in French. He spoke French to his daughters, right? He spoke French a lot, and Thomas Jefferson, of course, succeeded Benjamin Franklin as the first diplomat, number one, the minister to France. And so now let me get into Thomas Jefferson's education. Now, Thomas Jefferson is very significant. Of course, I read from the Declaration of Independence that he wrote. Thomas Jefferson did write, in a very simple and excessive and romantic, flowery, but it was still simple way. He had a particular style. So he did demonstrate the Enlightenment era principles. So the Enlightenment era, they focused on writing in a clear, having clarity, simplicity, and conciseness in writing. And so let me go into his, he took rhetoric when he was young, right? So he had many tutors. Now, he had wealthy parents, right? He had a wealthy father. They were landowners, not just they not only were large landowning family, but they also had numerous slaves. Throughout his lifetime, Thomas Jefferson owned about 600 slaves, and so the same thing with James Madison. So and George Washington. So obviously he didn't have to work to earn his living or do anything. All he had to do growing up was study. And so you see, Thomas Jefferson was one of our early polymaths. He was a polymath because he was wealthy. He had a lot of free time to do it. By the way, Thomas Jefferson had a love, was a bibliophile. He had a lifelong love of books, right? He loved books, and in fact, he had almost 6,500 volumes of books. When they say volumes, that's a number of books. So one volume is one book, equivalent. So he had, um, in fact, uh, because of his lavish lifestyle, right? He became insolvent, and after the U.S. government, the Library of Congress had lost its books collection due to the war with Britain, the War of 1812 with Britain, when they invaded Washington and they burned it down. The books in the Legislative Assembly, the of Congress were destroyed. The U.S. government in 1815 decided to buy Thomas Jefferson's book collection, about 6,487 volumes, right? Almost 6,500 volumes. That was the largest private library in America at that time, in North America. So Thomas Jefferson had the largest private library, right, in North America. So that's a lot of books, right? And so they paid him about almost $24,000. Well, I think it was about $23,950 that they paid Thomas Jefferson. That's $23,950 for 6,487 books, almost 6,500 volumes. So similarly, James Madison had a large library. His was about 4,000 volumes. But so Thomas Jefferson had a passion for books. He spent a lot of money. He had a large library, so you can see they studied a lot. Now he had tutors throughout his life at a very young age. He had tutors that taught him very early. He learned Latin, he learned Greek, he learned French, he learned mathematics, he learned philosophy. So their parents, those wealthy Virginia families, they invested a lot in the education of their children. At least Thomas Jefferson's, family. So he started off, with that, and then he goes to College of William and Mary. That was the College of William and Mary still exists today. That was the university, the college that Virginia aristocracy sent their kids to back then. So he went to College of William and Mary, and he studied philosophy, mathematics. He studied, rhetoric. Like I said, he studied rhetoric, the classics. He studied Latin, Greek, all these things, and logic. And after that, when he graduated, he went to read law for 5 years. I'd mentioned that he qualified as a lawyer, and he passed the bar. So he didn't like the practice of law, even though he had a great legal mind. Um, so, and now to James Madison. James Madison as well. James Madison, even though he was from Virginia, he similarly came from a very wealthy family, and of course, they started training him in Latin, Greek, philosophy since he was young, and he had some preparation and went off to College of New Jersey back then, which was unusual because he was from Virginia. College of New Jersey is now called Princeton. That's Princeton University. Of course, it's an Ivy League. So he went to study there, and his 4-year curriculum, he completed it in 2 years. Again, he studied philosophy, rhetoric, logic, mathematics, Greek, the classics. That was what he studied. And interestingly, he wasn't satisfied with his education. So he stayed one more year. He did graduate school. So he was the first graduate student of Princeton. He did one more year of advanced studies, studying Hebrew and political philosophy, right? So you can see the things he studied. That was part of what he put in our constitution, So you can see our constitution had to do with the law. Now, after he graduated from his graduate work, he went back home, studied again, did independent study because he was initially going to be a lawyer. So he asked a friend to give him who was studying law, right, who was a lawyer, to give him the curriculum that they studied um, under, a lawyer. So he got the curriculum and he bought the law books and he studied on his own. He never qualified as a lawyer, even though he studied the law books on his own. So you could see, and he continued to study history, philosophies. He studied the republics. He had a large library as well, 4,000 volumes of books. So he read a lot. And so you could see all his reading, the classics, studying old republics, confederacies. You can see how he put that into writing the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So he studied the old governments, Latin, the Roman Empire. He studied, the Greeks, old confederacies and republics. He studied all these things, and he put their pros and cons, their strengths and their weaknesses. He incorporated them in our constitution. Now, but these were wealthy men. I've mentioned how John Adams wasn't wealthy. His parents weren't wealthy, but his father invested in his education. He didn't want his father was a shoemaker, as I said. That's John Adams. He was a shoemaker. He was a farmer. He was a deacon. He didn't have money. He didn't have a college education himself. And John Adams wanted to be a farmer like his father, but his father commanded him. So parents can still teach. They can still implore. They can exhort their kids, persuade them, encourage them to study and go to college, and they can invest in their kids. You don't have to be wealthy in America to help your children go to college. Yes, the cost of education is atrocious today, and I'll get into that. So, but let me mention somebody who wasn't wealthy who got an excellent education as well. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, they had wealthy parents. They were very wealthy. They didn't have to do anything. So it was very easy for their parents to invest in their education. But think about Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, of course, was born poor. In fact, he was born out of wedlock. Not even in America, in Nevis, the island of Nevis. His mother, he was orphaned. His father abandoned them when he was young, and he was orphaned because his mother died when he was about 11 years old. So they had just a few dozen books in his home. He loved reading, though. So they had a few dozen books. So that was how he first started. So he didn't have the benefit of that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had, where they were studying Latin, French, the classics when they were young. But the books that they had in their home, he read from. When he was orphaned at 11, there were some people who took an interest in him. There was one Dr. Hugh Knox. Uh, he was a Presbyterian a reverend. He took an interest in him, and so he gave him books to read. And the guy was also a doctor, and then some other businessmen, right? They noticed his talent very young, so he was very lucky. He got benefactors. So even though he was he was he was poor and he was orphaned, he didn't do it all by himself. He was fortunate enough to get benefactors. So young people always need benefactors to be able to help them to get that education. Because so Alexander Hamilton was fortunate that even though he was a poor orphan boy, there were some merchants, they were actually from New York, who took an interest in him. And he started working as a clerk and bookkeeper. He learned accounting, he learned economics, he learned commerce practically. You can imagine a boy of 11 learning accounting, being a bookkeeper, learning practical business, learning all these things. So he learned the practical side. So you can see those skills translated in him becoming our first Treasury Secretary, right? The Treasury, they deal with money because he had an exposure to money at a very early age, from 11 years old, right? And there was something else he did. He had an ability to write. He had a gift. He wrote with a pseudonym. He wrote an essay on there was this hurricane in where he was. I think he was he because he was born in Nevis, but at some point he moved to the island of Saint Croix. Americans call it Saint Croix, but the island of Saint Croix, it's a French word. So and he wrote an essay about the hurricane, and people liked it, and people were like, wow, this person can write. And so they decided to pool money together. This is very famous, from Lin Manuel Miranda's Alexander Hamilton musical. They talk about it, how they gathered money for him to send him to America to get an education. His sister also put money together, so people always forget to mention that his sister funded his education. So you see, there are people who took an interest, who realized he needed an education. People didn't abandon the boy. There were people, elderly people, who didn't have means themselves, and they supported him. He went to America, and he went to what was called King's College at the time. So he went to a preparatory school first in New Jersey and started learning Latin and Greek, because back then those schools had to, they studied in Latin and Greek, you know. So he went to learn Latin, Greek, French himself, and he was a quick learner. He was very bright. His scholars through his they peg his own IQ at 175. Of course, the IQ wasn't invented during their time, but histometrics, by their accomplishment and their learning, their abilities and things like that, they're able to estimate, what their IQ scores, if they had been able to take an IQ score today, what it would be like. And they normally put Alexander Hamilton at 175. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson around 160, and Benjamin Franklin, around 160. There was a woman called Catherine, was it Catherine? Catherine Morris Cox, who did a hysterometric measure, and she guesstimated that Benjamin Franklin would have been around 160. But you see, they put Alexander Hamilton's way higher. I don't know if because of the challenges he overcame and, what he accomplished despite the obstacles that were in his way, right? He had greater obstacles than all of them. He was an immigrant, and I always call him America's greatest immigrant. And he was an orphan boy. He didn't have anything. He ended up going to King's College. So King's College is Columbia University today. That's my alma mater. I graduated from King's College, and he had, so he studied uh, mathematics, anatomy, and philosophy there. I think he was probably planning on becoming a physician because he had a mentor who was a physician. I mentioned Hugh Knox, the Reverend Hugh Knox. He was also a physician, so he probably had an interest in becoming a physician. So he studied that, but he didn't graduate because of the war. After the war, after he'd become, like Treasury Secretary or whatever, and he'd qualified for the uh, as a lawyer. He became a lawyer. He studied law on his own in 6 months. He got the book, studied it, passed the bar in 6 months. So he was a GEA. He was exceptional. Um, After that, Columbia decided to award him a Master of Arts degree. So even though he didn't graduate with that bachelor's, he awarded him a Master of Arts, an MA, Masters of Arts degree. So but during the war, he was fortunate that George Washington discovered him and made him his aide de camp. During the war, during his spare time, he was always studying. So he studied classics, Greek, military manuals, histories. He mastered them, mastered classics, foreign languages, style. It was so he was unusual during the war, right? And he was signed up for the military. It was George Washington's aide de camp. But he was studying during this period, right? So you can see why he was exceptional. And I've mentioned rhetoric. So rhetoric was a big part of their studies, and that's what you see reflected in the style and the simplicity of the writing of the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So rhetoric, it was based on the classical rhetoric principles. That's what they would study. So they would study composition, the essays of how to write in a certain style, and the way they did it was they studied the literary masters, the Greek masters, the classical masters, the Enlightenment masters, and they studied their style, and they would recopy what they wrote, what they studied. So they might pick up something in Latin, right? A master in Latin, and they translate it in Greek, or translate it in English, translate it in French. That was part of how they wrote. They would try and change the style. They studied them, the technique. And, so rhetoric was, it was based on the classical rhetoric principles, uh, based on the style of Aristotle and, uh, you know, and, it was, focused on what was called the five canons, right? And that included, invention. That's a canon of writing, of rhetoric. It included invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery, right? So those things were, the objective was to focus being persuasive in your writing, in your being, uh, learning to be persuasive, using language to influence your audience, right? Use language effectively to influence your audience. You might be focusing on ethics, trying to bring out an ethical principle, so you can see what it is that you can see. They're arguing that what they're doing is based on ethics, right? They're following an ethical principle. That an ethical principle, uh, you know, underscores, the objective. And so you can see that is part of rhetorical studies. So their composition is focused on, the mechanics of discourse, on argument and things like that. And you can see that was what they were studying in their curriculum, right? So the rhetorical studies. And of course, the masters that they studied, as I've mentioned, they would emulate them. They pick up their texts and try to copy them, note their techniques, their styles. I mentioned David Hume was one of them. Jonathan Swift, right? I liked Swift. I read, everybody knows Gulliver's Travels. Jonathan Swift, by the way, he invented words. When you think of Brobdignagian, Brobdignagian, okay, it skipped me. Lilliputian. When you talk about Lilliputian or Yahoo was invented by the word Yahoo, right? Was actually invented by uh, Jonathan Swift, right? It's interesting. So Yahoo means like crazy or wild people, savage, right? So Yahoos were in his book Gulliver's Travels. It's funny because Jonathan Swift himself, uh, he was certified, crazy towards the end of his life. People thought he was eccentric. That's Jonathan Swift, of course. He was a brain. His writing was fantastic. I read his Battle of the Tub, um, many books like that. So these were things that our founding fathers studied. They will study these classical writers and try and emulate them. They studied histories, and so you can see um, how this influenced their style. Now, I've talked about this today because the education today is atrocious, and um, many younger people are saying they don't want to go to college. The school that um, Alexander Hamilton went to, Columbia University, their tuition today, I was just looking at their tuition, is about, for undergrad is about over $69,000 a year for tuition alone. And it's in New York, about the most expensive city in America. So your cost of living and books will probably amount to about 40,000 a year. Your tuition alone is over 69,000 a year. So you're looking at, that's an astronomical amount of money. Way over 120,000 a year for your education, undergraduate education. If you go to Columbia University for 4 years, you're looking at 480, almost $500,000 a year, over $400,000 a year. So that's a cost of a house. So you can see why a lot of people are saying they don't want to go to school there. In fact, their law school is more expensive. Their law school is $84,000 a year just for tuition. We're not talking about the cost of living. So to go to law school, uh, Plus if you were to include, well, not everybody will go there. Let me consider my own law school. I graduated from George Washington University Law School. I noticed that the tuition right now, the price tag is about $69,000 a year, right? That's almost $70,000 just for tuition. Again, George Washington University is right next to the White House, right next to the World Bank, the IMF. So it's one of the most expensive places also in DC, right? So that area, you can see it probably costs, when I went to school there, it cost a bundle. So we're talking cost of living plus your books, probably about $40,000 a year, right? 40,000, your books, feeding, room and board, probably will probably cost you about 40,000, 50,000 a year, right? And that's 3 years. So 40 plus 70, we're looking at about, uh, hmm, you know, tuition and all that. If we said 50,000 a year, it really costs. We're looking at about $120,000 a year, right? And law school's 3 years, so that's about $360,000, right, a year for law school. At George Washington, at Columbia, that's a lot more for just law school. Columbia, we're looking at about half a million, over 400,000 just for law school. So if you want to be an undergrad and have a law degree, like those people did, our founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams did. They had their undergrads, and they had their law degrees. I mean, they became lawyers. If you want to do accomplish that today, because you can no longer be an apprentice like them, you can no longer apprentice to be a lawyer like them and just read law, right? You can't do that anymore. You have to go to law school. So you're looking at education at almost about $800,000, almost $1 million, right? To just have a bachelor's and a law degree in America. So you can see why a lot of young people are saying, they don't want to go to school. In fact, the reason why I decided to do this video is because I saw an interview by a Yale Law School professor. His name's Daniel Markovits. Daniel Markovits. He wrote a book called The Meritocracy Trap, and he said that, look, the idea of meritocracy that America keeps talking about today is fake, right? It's misleading. It's disingenuous. It's not true. That there's no meritocracy anymore. And he's saying the wealthy game the system. I don't completely agree with him, but he's saying, but anyway, let me quickly say what he said. He says the wealthy are gaming the system because they overinvest in their children's education. And education is so expensive today. They can afford to give their children private tutors, go to private schools and everything to get into the best schools, and they give them more private schooling. And, so, and the poor, the middle class are priced out of this, that the wealthy are the ones investing in their kids. Mind you, the interviewer noted that the professor who wrote this book and is criticizing the system, he himself has all these expensive elite education. His bachelor's, that's Daniel Markovits, who's a professor at Yale. His bachelor's is in mathematics from Yale University. Then he has another master's in econometrics and mathematical economics from London School of Economics in England. He has another bachelor's, right? So he has two bachelors. He already had a bachelor's and a master's, and he goes to get another bachelor's and a PhD from Oxford University in philosophy. And then he goes back to Yale Law School for a law degree. He's a law professor. So he had all these education that's extremely expensive. I was just talking about the cost of just having a bachelor's and a law degree now in America. It's approaching $1 million if you just have a bachelor's and a law degree. That's the value of a house, a very nice house, right? And so you can see why young people are saying they don't want to do that unless you have wealthy parents who will invest in that. And so something, however, he doesn't say how he got his education. If it was his wealthy parents who gave him that education, that opportunity, because he went to very expensive schools, and he just kept getting an education, right? There are people, because I know people, right, in the Nigerian community. I know people who are not rich, the parents aren't rich, and they're able to train their kids because they have a priority of training their children. And their children are medical doctors, lawyers, right? They're not rich, right? They came to America as immigrants. They do they do very low skilled work, many of them, and but because they made sacrifice for their children, education was a very important it's very important to their family and the culture, the Nigerian community. Um, they're able to train their children and become medical doctors, become lawyers, very expensive, right? And sacrifice for their children. So that's the issue. But I do agree. It's a matter of policy, right? I think the government has to learn. I'm also, of course, I'm a trained accountant. Um, it's a matter of policy, and the government has to learn to see its citizens as assets, right? So, as an accountants have the books, the records, and they see everything as either assets or liabilities. America has to see its citizens and its children as assets. So if you have an asset, an accountant, you invest and improve your asset because it's going to help you generate money. It's going to give back to you. I'm not saying that we should see human beings as property. That's not what I'm saying. But that we have value, right? Americans have value and our children in America have value. And I'm just advocating for public education. That the government should invest more in public education. And it's not doing that so that our young people can have opportunities to go to college, right? Because going to college is not just about being trained to get a skill so you can work. It's also about being a better person because they train you as a whole person to be a good citizen, right? The values that you inculcate in college. Now, many people who don't want to go to college, they also forget that you also go and network. It's not just about making uh, friends and partying in college. No, you network for your future. There are certain professions in which you need good networks. I just remember, so I've been job hunting, right? And I just remembered my first roommate in America. I first went to a public school in America, in Alabama, Troy, Alabama. Now, my first roommate is a partner, is a CPA, and is a partner in a big law firm, right? And I noticed the law firm that he works for, it's a big law firm, and he's a partner there, he's a CPA, and they're hiring. And because I've maintained contact with him, I was able to reach out to him, hey, you know, what's up with this job, right? And he's like, oh, I'm going to look out for you. No, no trouble at all, right? It was my first roommate in Alabama. So you have opportunities for networking if you go to college. I'm just trying to give you the benefits of going to college. If you want to raise money, if you decide that you want to be a business person, the first people you go to are the networks you have from college, right? I was a financial advisor, you, for a big bank at one time, a stockbroker, right? You need to have networks so you can build your book of business. You could get introductions, people who know you. So that's another thing that you benefit from going to college, right? You increase your scope of influence, your circle of influence, you increase that and your networks, right? You don't necessarily get that if you're just going to flip burgers at McDonald's and you want to make a career of that, right? So it depends on what you do. So college is very important. It's still very significant, and parents can focus on their children's education. If parents have that priority, you can get it done, right? You can still get an opportunity to do it. Now, maybe I could talk about how I did it. I have over 4 university degrees. I didn't come here to America with my parents. I came alone, right? And I got to graduate from an Ivy League university. I didn't have family support, right? Many immigrants have family support. I got to. I'm not using it to brag. And many times when I talk about my father's background, yes, my father was a bank CEO and a bank chairman in Nigeria. I'm trying to point out because I've heard people want to try and point me out that hey, I came pull myself up by my bootstraps here in America. No, no, no. I have the foundation back home in Nigeria. My parents invested in my education in Nigeria. So when I came here alone, I was already prepared to take advantage of whatever opportunities or work hard and get additional degrees. I got a law degree from a private university, George Washington University. I graduated from got another bachelor's degree from an Ivy League, right, Columbia University. I got my MBA, got additional, I went to school in Europe as well. So how did I get it done without the support of family? I didn't have any family supporting me here in America, but I was already well prepared back home in Nigeria. So I'm a Christian. There's something in the Bible that says, teach a child, right? Train a child in the way he should go when he's young. When he grows up, he will not depart from it. So, of course, if parents want to have their children go to college, it's the sort of emphasis that they give their children when they're young. They have the opportunity to shape them, mold them, and help them to focus on education really early, no matter what the government policy is. Government policy is very important, though. And so the reason, again, I'm doing this video is, we all admire the US Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And the reason why it is so eloquent, it is so forceful, it remains, it remains like eternal today, and it's still so significant for us, and still so applicable, right? It's timeless. It's still applicable. We still see the logic in it. It's still our zeitgeist. It's still our north star. It's still our raison d'etre, right? Is because of the sort of education our founding fathers had. And, uh, James Madison, the author of our U.S. Constitution, we call him the father of the U.S. Constitution, the author of the Bill of Rights, which is part of the U.S. Constitution, and of course the author of the Declaration of Independence, whom John Adams said had a felicity of expression, right? It was because of the sort of training that their parents were able to invest in them, and then benefactors of Alexander Hamilton, who was poor and was an orphan. He had benefactors who invested in him. So this is something our society, it's supposed to be the richest country in the world. And education helped us, right? It was our investment in the GI Bill after the Second World War. And we had such a large educated class, created a huge middle class. And, we were able to advance in technology. Look at all the technological advancements we have today. It's from our universities. So we shouldn't shut out our children from these universities that are creating opportunities for growth and employment. My name is Olurotimi Osha. This video has gotten long. I might do another video just talking more about education. You can see I'm passionate about education, and I think it's really unfair if our children are not getting an opportunity to get the quality education they need, because they're being priced out. These atrocious prices today, the cost of universities, and of course there can be government policy that makes university affordable. Of course, there are other choices. I also went to a public university, but these public universities are very expensive today as well. See, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia, which he made public, right? He wanted to make public education accessible to Americans. He knew that he had an unfair advantage as a wealthy slave owner, landholding aristocrat, right? And he was able to amass a private library that was the largest in the world, and it actually was the foundation of our Library of Congress. He had one human being, and other, masses of Americans, the commoners, didn't have that access. So he created University of Virginia to make it a public university accessible to people. Their law school today, I was just checking the price of their law school. It's over $77,000, right? For in-state, it's just about $3,000 less, $74,000 a year, just the tuition. We haven't talked about the cost of living, right? The cost is comparable to the cost of it's comparable to the cost of private universities, right? I think my school, the law school tuition for George Washington University, where I graduated from, I think is about $72,000. $72,000, yeah, $72,000 a year. Columbia University's law school is $84,000. So they're comparable. I mean, University of Virginia is not looking like a like a public university. It's as expensive as a private university, So this is not fair for middle class Americans, and I can see that, Professor Daniel Markovits' gripe. But the issue is, getting public policy to focus on making university college accessible to all Americans, right? We know college is is very important. Are there alternatives? Are there alternatives to learning? We still need proof that somebody has gone and focused on a curriculum and learned. Our founding fathers, they thought it was important. Were the ones who were wealthy and the ones who weren't wealthy, like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. Education was very important, and that was why we were able to have the sort of great start, right, that we had as a country. Again, my name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the court that I've been suffering in Montgomery County, Maryland. It's not come to an end yet. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.